In the room this morning, Eric Latif is my name. We have Ndohho, we have Seti Muga, and we have Wanjiru Gekonyo. She's our guest host for this week. We are now discussing public debt management and, the moving towards debt relief transparency in Kenya. Let's speak to the former Director General of the Public Debt Management Office at the National Treasury. His name is Wohoro Ndohho. He is an economist, a public finance expert, also a commentator on impacts of economic policy. Wohoro, thank you very much for speaking to us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room.
Asante.
Now, in this COVID era, we'd like next time that you come and sit next to us here so we can have this conversation face to face.
Yes, so.
Yeah. You've heard the kind of introduction that we had to this topic.
Yes, interesting.
What do you mean interesting? When someone tells you interesting, it implies very many. It could also imply that you guys got it so wrong that
it was very interesting.
That it was very interesting. Your perspective really
was interestingly wrong.
Yes.
No, I think I like the idea of debate. I think there's a couple of things we underrate as Kenyans. Is just how much public policy is debated in the public square.
Yep.
That is, it is not something to take for granted, and I think the high level of this debate, I think, is a welcome addition to our public conversations.
So you were the Director General of this Debt Management Office. Among the things that we were saying is this is a department of the National Treasury, which therefore does not have a lot of leeway in exercising autonomy. Many of the decisions that are made by the DG of the Public Debt Management Office will have to be checked, edited, and approved by somebody senior, which means that even if you had some contrary opinion to what the National Treasury wanted to do in terms of debt policy, then you are overruled. Is that the case?
Well, I think I'll address it in a more broader context, that any person who works in the executive, of course, is subject to directions of the executive.
Yep.
Maybe the question is more, is there a framework within the law for that? And actually, there is. The PFM Act does give the Public Debt Management Office some autonomy, semi-autonomy. The question is just giving effect. I think earlier this year, the minister began that process of granting that semi-autonomy to the PDMO.
Mm-hmm.
Now, beyond that, you could say that of any public office. And maybe something just to clarify something. Debt is an effect; it's not a cause. Debt is the effect of expenditure exceeding revenue. And so even this conversation around managing debt really belongs there first. Because at the end of the day, if you have a budget deficit, if you are running unbalanced budgets or budget deficit, then you are going to end up with a debt situation.
So it starts from that point of the budget policy.
Yes.
Looking at, for example, this particular financial year, we are beginning the financial year with a budget deficit of upwards of 800 billion shillings.
Right.
So therefore, we're basically talking about we are going to borrow 800 billion shillings in the minimum to meet our spending needs.
Correct. And I think that even in that, you will get a situation where by borrowing, because your expenditures are consistently always higher than your revenues, really the conversation we should be having are what we call a fiscal consolidation. Can the government cut back on expenditure? The problem, of course, is in light of COVID right now, the government cutting back in expenditure is exactly the opposite of what we would expect the government to do, because we need to stimulate the economy.
Right. Mr. Wohoro, as we stand here and we look at this heavy debt burden, some of this debt was procured at a very high cost to the country, unsustainably and imprudently, actually. There have been criticisms about the type of debt Kenya went for, the conditions for borrowing, especially the commercial borrowing, the projects that were going to receive this money. There was no evidence that they could pay back that money in the time frame which this money was borrowed. There were transparency issues around for instance, the Eurobond, where part of the money borrowed didn't even get into the consolidated fund, which is unconstitutional. So there has been imprudent decisions made around it. I mean, the executive can run a deficit, and then what then is the role of the DMO to advise the executive on how to fund the deficit, and how does the DMO then ensure that the decisions made around debt do not undermine the sustainability, the fiscal position? Because right now Kenya actually is at risk of defaults, and you've seen the international creditors flagging this. As civil society, we had actually flagged the sustainability of Kenya's debt as risky, and the reason we did that is we said the investments themselves were not sound. So we are seeing, to what extent or what has been the reason behind the type of debt decisions that have been made, and do you think those, maybe you disagree, were those decisions sound, or those decisions driven by faulty information and also some corrupt decisions? Of course, there's been some indictments around this. Yeah. Yes.
Well, let me just start by saying, first and foremost, is that the debt department itself has very good people in terms of expertise, knowledge, and there's a whole protocol around how these loans are analyzed and recommendations are put forward. Now, those recommendations are just their recommendations. They have they're not legally binding to the superiors, for the simple reason that the executive cannot have many centers of power. Now, as far as the question then of whether it was sustainable, whether that particular decision could have been made better, there's a whole mechanism around the constitutional framework in which we work in. And to some extent, I think to a large extent, this is also a question that goes beyond the technical expertise of the PDMO. There are other institutions that are also part of that decision chain. And one of them, of course, a clear one is the parliament itself. And even within Parliament, there's one little office which we don't hear much about, but I think should be given. I think we should pay a lot of attention to it, and that is the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Yeah.
That by law is mandated to give expertise, arm's length expertise and knowledge or advice to the Parliament in making decisions regarding any document coming to it from the Treasury. And I'll draw your attention to a couple of the reports. In fact, the last one was for the BPS, in which section, I think from clause 73, they then analyze the PDMO's recommendations and proposals to Parliament. So to your question, Wanjiru, about whether something was sustainable or not, yes, the technical expertise is there, and it is given as a matter of course, as a matter of professional course. The question then becomes that beyond that point, when you're just a technical expert, who then has the legislative and constitutional mandate to then make a decision on whether it is a good decision or not? That does not reside necessarily in the PDMO. The PDMO is there to be the technical expertise that gives the advice. Once it gets into Parliament, then there's a second conversation around there.
So when you see the country going more and more into commercial debts, is that advice that's coming from the experts at the PDMO?
Well, one of the things that changed in the last 3 years was, one is we rebased the Kenya rebased its economy, and we were then promoted, so to speak, into a lower middle income country.
Promoted, yeah.
With that promotion, with that elevation, new sources of funding became accessible to us. Now, as to the wisdom of whether we took them for the right reason, that again, referring back to Wanjiru's question, was something that was put in a context of advice to the executive. The decision thereafter then belongs elsewhere.
So what in this particular case would the PDMO have advised?
There would have been a range of them. There's a data sustainability analysis that's always done for any loan that's going to be taken. There's a conversation, of course, that is had with the budget team as far as the budget performance is concerned. And because by and large debt would happen to come into the room when expenditures begin to exceed the revenue, early in the conversation around budget, the PDMO would, of course, have been consulted. Now, the options between taking concessional loans, which is the World Bank and the multilateral organizations, versus commercial, it was a function of the fact that suddenly we were in a place where we had more options than just the traditional one. Now, as the motivations why one would pick a commercial loan versus a concessional loan, again, once the recommendations are made, then that decision then belongs to others up the food chain.
Right, Mr. Wohoro. From what you're telling us, it sounds then that maybe I'll put it in a more positive way. As the PDMO is presently structured, does it meet best practice? Because we are still awaiting the policy. These conversations, I don't know whether it's in abeyance or what has happened. Different recommendations were made. In your view, what's the best practice? What have been the gaps in this process? Is it enough for the PDMO to give technical advice? And what are the gaps in the debt procurement process that have driven us to a 1 trillion debt?
Well, on several levels. One, it is true that the PDMO, I keep emphasizing, the PDMO does not have a problem with expertise. So the issue is not expertise or best practice, even internationally. The question then becomes that in the decision-making process, beyond the technical advice, who else needs to be in that room? And that's the national debate we are having. If you were to ask me, could PDMO do better? Of course, we could always do better. But as far as the technical side of it, I cannot fault the PDMO. And of course, I have a bias to the extent that I've actually worked with the team.
Yeah.
But it's the fact that once you're told, okay, we have a gap of, let's say, 200 billion. Do we borrow domestically or do we borrow externally? That becomes a conversation that will also include our fiscal agent in the Central Bank of Kenya. It will also include the budget team saying, okay, given this is a gap, is there anything in our expenditure that can be rationalized? Then suddenly the conversation of debt management belongs in the right space where it brings all these other actors into the room.
But ultimately, the politician will make the decision.
Ultimately, not just politician, but it's a fact that even before the politician makes that decision, he is given as far as the machinery of due diligence in the system, there is sufficient space there for it to happen. Maybe the question we should also be asking is, to what extent we as a public are we aware and how well read are we as far as the documents regarding debt are concerned? So, for example, right now we've got the public debt management strategy that was approved as part of the budget process. I would actually say take a very close look at that. Look at even the Parliamentary Budget Office's response to it. Then I think you'll find that some of these conversations actually belong in some very interesting places in terms of enforcing some of the questions I think Wanjiru is alluding to.
So, City, you have a question for Wohoro.
Yes, there was a 2012 Public Finance Management Act which sought to actually ensure that this office of the Director General has the powers of the Treasury Cabinet Secretary. Were these powers? Yes.
Powers of the CS?
No. The specific person who deals with such matters within Treasury. Yes. There was a secretary whose job was just to manage those things.
Okay.
Right now, some of these powers were supposed to be transferred to the DG, which would have given him a little more autonomy. What I'm actually asking is, was this ever the case?
I think what you're referring to is the PFM Act gives the Public Debt Management Office
Yes.
a semi-autonomous status
Yes.
within the Treasury. It is the only department in Treasury that's also mentioned in the Constitution, giving it a fairly special place in the hierarchy of institutions. There's also a second office that was supposed to be within the Department of Debt, which was the holder of what do you call government securities. Yes, I can't remember that's the name. So that when government raises any bonds, basically those will be registered by the PDMO as part of its autonomous function. Now, the practice of it, I think, to some extent, it was all part of the implementation, the rollout of the implementation of the various constitutional functions. And I think, to a large extent, that was not fully implemented. In fact, it was one of the big impetuses for why this year that whole issue was revisited, with a view of actually granting the PDMO that independence.
But Wohoro, there was specifically the borrowing powers that the cabinet secretary had. Was that ever transferred?
No. That and I think I need to double check that. The borrowing powers cannot be independent of the CS of Finance. It must only be in consultation because, as I said, a debt is an effect. It is not a cause in its own right. So that the conversation should always start with budgeting, with balancing the budget. And if that can happen, then that comes into the room. And there's been some interesting developments even since my time and even after. And that's been the fact that the PDM must sit in a conversation about budget a lot more, rather than getting invited after the fact once the budget has been established. And that, even for my time, was a very useful and rich conversation to have, so that the budget making process itself, by having the PDMO in the room, also meant that some of the harder questions around expenditure control could be raised and addressed.
Right. Mr. Wohoro, from a transparency point of view, there are concerns in regard to two areas. In Kenya, we appear unable to track the expenditure of debt. So, the procurement maybe now has more transparency in terms of this amount of money and this is where it's going. But then once it enters into, it becomes expenditure, we are not then able to say where, the Eurobond money went exactly. So number one, that's a transparency concern when we are looking at value for money, for instance, to Kenyans. Then also, I think in February or maybe end of January, the Parliament complained that they didn't have the debt register. So they weren't able to get the conditions, the terms, what collateral has government used, and when you mention the holder of securities, I don't know whether this is the office that holds the contracts and these contractual terms and the register. And I think Treasury was given 90 days to publish this. They haven't published. So in your view, do you agree this is a problem? How do we fix it? And how do we get the transparency we need?
Right. Okay, maybe let me start the second part. It's actually called a Register of Government Securities. It's supposed to be an independent office within the PDMO, whose office holder is supposed to be appointed by the Cabinet Secretary. That is one of the reforms that are currently under review, alongside the issue of the independence of the PDMO. To your second question of transparency, and this is actually goes to more than just the PDMO. The PDMO, I think, is on in the lights now because of our debt situation. But to the extent that the Constitution gives that oversight power to Parliament, really, I think the solution revolves around what tools and instruments Parliament has to enforce that. Because, for example, there is a debt register, an extent to which it's been requested by Parliament. then that is not a question beyond, that is not a question of the PDMO itself complying or not complying. It's a question of the National Treasury complying to a directive of Parliament. And you can readily appreciate that even if I was the Director General today, the responsibility of responding to a request from Parliament belongs to my Cabinet Secretary. And all we are the principal assistants to him.
Well, Wohoro Ndohho, we want to thank you very much for speaking to us today. It's been a very short interview, but it's a useful one. We want to invite you to come to the studio for like a full 4 hours, so we can talk.
Yes, I think there's a lot.
You
There's a lot
can
to unpack.
explain to us how we have arrived at 900 billion shillings in debt. Step by step.
And where the money went.
And where the money went. And
the conversation must not be edited.
Yes. Asante
I
sana,
think I'm
Wohoro.
editing it.
Asante sana. No, we believe you're not editing it. But having you face to face, we'll be able to tell whether you actually are editing it.
So you can read my body language.
Asante sana. Wohoro Ndohho is a former Director General of the Public Debt Management Office at the National Treasury. We'll have him here again to talk about our national debt, our public debt. Thank you very much, Wohoro. Have a good day.
Karibu, asante.